This week on the nonprofit news feed brought to you by Whole Whale, well, we're talking about how tragedy is being remembered at 9/11, 22 years after the fateful day. We're talking about some data on compensation for male and female CEOs in the nonprofit sector, some documentaries coming out. Nick, how's it going?
It's going great, George. How are you?
I'm doing all right today. I think there's some interesting things we're seeing in September with a lot of non-profit charity movies coming out. We have Uncharitable. We have a HBO documentary. I don't want to jump it though, because we do want to start with news about how 9/11 was commemorated this year in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. I can start us off. So, our first story, as you mentioned, is that as we record this on September 12th, yesterday, when we wrote the nonprofit newsfeed, was, of course, September 11th. George, this is, I think, our second or third anniversary on podcast. And we all like to do a little shout out just to commemorate. You and I are both New Yorkers at heart, and it's something that hits home. So, the focus for our write up this week was that the anniversary of September 11th also coincides with the opening of a new performing arts center. So, the current World Trade Center has multiple buildings, but this was one of the last prongs of the essentially decades long process of rebuilding. So, the World Trade Center is jointly operated by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and it's announced the opening of its new performing arts center. And the executive director of the arts center says the memorial is here for people to come and grieve and pay their respects. The museum is here for people to learn, be aware, and never forget. And the Performing Arts Center is here for people to celebrate life and really celebrate the resilience of New Yorkers and the country, which I think sums it up perfectly. So this comes at a time when arts are struggling a little bit in the city. I think it could provide a meaningful jolt to the creative ingenuity that in many ways has defined what makes New York great. We also wanted to highlight the efforts of the folks over at 9/11 Day, which has turned tragedy into action by encouraging folks to do good deeds across the United States and has actually become the largest national day of service in this country. So, really paying it forward.
Yeah, my mom was a lifetime employee of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and so there were many memories that I had of the area. Great to see a performing arts center being added to the amazing tributes that are in that area, of course. And yeah, our friends at 911day.org are, still championing the way that we should, I think, as a nation, remember that tragic day in a way of action. And love seeing them year after year pushing the narrative of giving back on a day where so much was lost. So well done, 911day.org. All right. There's a compensation report coming from Candidate's 2023 nonprofit report finding that female CEOs make 73 cents on each dollar for male CEOs, which I feel like is in line with macro trends of female compensation in the marketplace. I was just so surprised to also see this reflected in the nonprofit sector. Nick, anything else to add on this one?
Yeah, George, I think you really hit it on the head there. Of course, we talked about kind of gender inequity on this podcast. And I think what strikes me is almost the imbalance, right? I think the nonprofit sector has come such a long way and is a sector that is thinks and or talks a lot about issues of equity and inequality, but this is quite disappointing to see, to be honest. Maybe a wake-up call, right? That, talking and convening frameworks and et cetera, and DEI statements, all that stuff is just the beginning. And when we look at, in this case, outcomes with regards to CEO pay, the difference, the stark difference is it's honestly shocking.
Yeah, and this wasn't a little online survey either. They have done what seems to be the most robust analysis of 120,000 different tax exempt organizations for the fiscal year of 2021. And that's, a lot of data. And frankly, it's all available in the 990s. There's no sort of hiding that compensation pay. The top three highest paid people in a 990 are revealed at a nonprofit. It's just part of that disclosure. And so you can just run that analysis for anybody to see. So, if you're ever curious about what the compensation of what the CEOs or high paid individuals are of a nonprofit, go take a look at the 990. We actually end up using our friends at, oh, what is it? Oh, I'm blanking.
Cause
Cause
IQ.
IQ. Cause IQ. I'm not cutting that. Yeah, check out kaiziq.com if you're trying to check out the individual 990s. But I appreciate this work being done by Candid to, reveal what is in the data.
Yeah, no, George, I absolutely agree. One number that stuck out to me was that women represent the majority of CEOs at smaller organizations, but they represent less than one third of CEOs at the largest budget organizations, which means that perhaps unsurprisingly, I think probably a lot of nonprofits see women overrepresented, not in any way a bad way, right? But a lot of nonprofits have, just skew woman heavy in staff. But that's not making its way to large nonprofits that are large in size at all. Like that's a 2-to-1 disparity there. So clearly there's a ton of work to do in bringing equity there. All right. I'll take us into our next story. And George, this is the moment we've been waiting for. So this is from Rolling Stone, but HBO has just announced a 3-part, essentially mini documentary series called Savior Complex, which follows missionary Renee Bach, who at a young age was encouraged via the spirit of missionary work to go to Africa and care for malnourished children. However, in the process, through a series of kind of unexplicable circumstances, began performing invasive medical procedures on these children. And hundreds of children died within her care. And nurses in the trailer, which I encourage you to watch, say that Renee was Googling essentially medical information as she was performing these procedures on children. The victims, particularly the mothers of the children who died, granted, a lot of them did not die, right? But many did in the care of this facility run by Renee Bach. Many did die. The victims feel that they have not been compensated and that justice has not been brought. Nothing happened to Renee Bach, despite performing not even with medicine without a license of any sort, but medicine without seemingly any training whatsoever. This woman was not even a nurse or nurse practitioner, let alone a doctor. So we're going to get a spicy documentary dropping. And this coincides actually in the same kind of same week as the documentary Uncharitable. So a lot of kind of big reckoning documentaries for the nonprofit sector coming out in the next couple of weeks. But George, what do you think of this story? There seems to be narratives that people are kind of done hearing about this woman. They want her story to just go away and not elevate her. She very clearly is interviewed in this documentary. People seem frustrated that this person got to kind of tell their side of the story, quote unquote. What's your take on this whole situation?
I think less about the individual, but larger about the system of savior complex. And in their summary, saying, hopefully addressing the wider question around white saviorism and the ethics of foreign aid done in the name of humanitarian and religious ideas. And I think this is incredibly important as we sort of hold up the mirror on whether or not the types of aid provided by various institutions are actually helpful or harmful. In this case, allegedly, as many as 800 children died at her hands. And so, while I think a lot of this had a lot of social media judgment, and I think the court of Twitter appeal lacks a little due diligence. I think the truth ends up lying somewhere in the middle. And frankly, if in the middle of, oh, a 19-year-old went there, practiced medically on children from the good of her heart, ended up killing so much as one child, that's too many. And I think hopefully this leads to additional regulation because, as you mentioned, there's no extradition for this. There's no manner of penalty for, even if you in mean best of intentions. If you tried to do that in the United States, you would be subject to the law, malpractice, and I think even criminal negligence. I like the book. Frankly, you're not allowed to kill children if you don't have a medical license. You're not allowed to kill children if you do have a medical license. Like it's disturbing, and especially when it's done under the banner of humanitarian aid and sort of a religious umbrella. It makes me a little sick, actually. But I'm waiting to see this documentary. I want to try to look at it and see, how I feel about it. I want to be very clear. Uncharitable, actually, as it happens, is the Dan Pilata narrative, which is actually very positive, and that's coming out in middle of September as well, which is talking about how the overhead myth impacts the upside potential, as I understand it, for nonprofits in our country to do do more effective work. Very, very different.
Very, very different. But I think both are really important, right? And I think that being allowed to have these conversations about what does it mean to run an ethical charity? How do charities fit into our culture? What types of charities should no longer uh, be held up to the standard, whether it's, religious missionary work, which, not all of them are bad, but what makes charities good or bad? I think that those are important conversations to have, and they're worth having because the longer we go on without having them, uh, the less trust the charitable sector has and the less good that can ultimately be done, right? We talked, George, about trust, that big trust report that comes out every year. Charities are among America's most trusted institutions, but they're slipping, right? They're slipping with all the other institutions. So as
Yeah.
news media
They're
and
falling,
government
like,
think
within a
about,
couple points
you know,
of and, we'll wait for that, I think, the Edelman report coming out. They fall within a couple points, of businesses at this point and, having this come out on, national level HBO, pushing it out there, I don't know how much it'll be, taken up, but, that hurts, right? It doesn't take much to ruin a reputation.
absolutely. Absolutely. George, we actually want to talk about kind of I mean, this is a disaster story in the literal sense of the word, but also brings up some interesting questions. Our next story is we linked to the Washington Post in here, but of course has been all over the news, and that is the earthquake in Morocco. So this was one of the most powerful earthquakes to hit the region within the past essentially century. Um, and there's lots of questions as Moroccans and remote villages complain about the lack of state assistance and aid. Lots of questions also about the resiliency of buildings. Many of the buildings were made in uh, kind of mud style brick. Brick is notoriously uh, susceptible to the impacts of earthquakes. And I think now the death toll, sadly, is well over 2,000 and likely expected to rise in the next days and weeks. So um, we like to talk about these to bring attention to them. But yeah, George, what do we think about this?
I think it's interesting in the order of our reporting and our listing of stories today of like whether you question foreign aid from the United States, but in Morocco, they're, according to this report from, a couple places I'm looking at like courthousenews.com, Morocco's still weighing offer for US aid after deadly earthquake. Reportedly, nearly 3,000 people, possibly more at this point, have been reported dead from Friday's earthquake. And so the question is, what is their stance on accepting foreign aid from the United States? And I think there are some mixed messages coming through, but there are clearly folks offering ways of donating in order to support the devastation and rebuilding in Morocco.
Absolutely. We'll continue to follow this. But I think earthquakes are particularly tricky because there's no warning for earthquakes. Or if there is warning, it's minutes, seconds, right? So there's not a lot a government can do to prepare. We talked about actually similar dynamics a little bit in Turkey and how that actually had some implications there, talking about the earthquake. But yeah, just hope that Morocco and Moroccans exhibit resiliency and are able to bounce back. George, how about a feel good?
Yeah, which one are you going to choose?
All right. I'm going with this one from CBS News, where a nonprofit deploys high tech barge to collect plastic from rivers. So these barges, if you watch the video, you can see them. They look like little, I don't know, what are those boats? I don't know. They look like barges. But
Barges
they're
with cranes on them, right? With
barges with cranes.
excavators on them.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the nonprofit that runs them is called Ocean Cleanup. And the goal is to ultimately collect 90% of floating plastic pollution from the world's waterways, which is a noble goal. Sounds like a challenging one, but I don't know. It's so cool, right? It's one of those things where it's such a simple problem with such a simple solution, and it's still so hard to execute. So it's amazing to see people giving it a shot.
Well, I'll just say here that I'm also a big fan of ocean cleanup because they're focused on the waterways and the ways that rivers lead to ocean plastic, and so they do a phenomenal job with video footage, right? Like it'd be one thing to like do this sort of cleanup in a corner and just report on an overall number, but what a great example of bring a
What
camera
a great
and
example.
tell that story, put it out there, and they just have tremendous videos for, showing the actual impact of the work, which leads to like, hey, there's momentum. Yeah, it's an intractable problem if you understand the floating plastic island in the middle of the Pacific, the size of Texas, is like, throw your hands up. I think watching groups like this do the work and frankly tell the story on social media is a great example. So, at the very least, take a look at what their digital footprint looks like, and the art of storytelling that they're employing is spot on. And news outlets certainly pick this up as well, which gives you another bite at the apple. All right, Nick, I do have a question for you. Why did
Okay.
hear me out though. Like, why did the blood drive turn away Taylor Swift?
Oh no. I don't know.
I think you do know. They heard she has bad blood. I'm not
Oh,
going to sing it, but those that know. However, I will add, because I'm trying to add some facts to this, that traditionally January is a month where blood is most needed due to reduced donations, increase in sickness, and snow disruptions. Though I will say the current call by the American Red Cross is that their coffers, maybe that's the wrong word, their blood supply is actually dropped lower than 20 to 25% for where they feel like it should be due to summer travel disruption, disaster travel. And so they're looking for increased blood donations. If you're out there and you have blood to give, consider scheduling something.
awesome. Thank you, George.
Thanks, Nick.